I should have known something had shifted when I found myself lingering in the hallway that night, toothbrush still dripping mint foam onto the worn carpet beneath my bare feet. The apartment was quiet in that particular way it gets after midnight. Not empty, but suspended, like the world outside had paused to let us exist in this pocket of dim yellow light and shared solitude. Lionel was leaning against his doorframe, shoulder pressed into the painted wood that had been chipped and scarred by countless previous tenants. His hair was tousled from running his hands through it during his engineering homework, dark strands falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than his 22 years. He wore the same gray t-shirt he'd had on all day, soft from too many washes, hanging loose on his frame in that careless way that somehow made everything about him seem effortless. The hallway between our bedrooms had never felt so narrow. 3 steps, maybe 4 if you counted generously, separated his door from mine. I'd walked this distance thousands of times over the past year and a half, padding to the bathroom in the morning, carrying laundry, rushing to grab textbooks before class. But tonight, standing there with toothpaste still coating my tongue, those few feet felt charged with something I couldn't name. He was grinning at me. That was Lionel's default expression, this easy, lopsided smile that he wore like armor, deflecting the world's sharp edges with casual charm. But there was something different about it tonight, something that made my chest tighten with a familiar ache I'd learned to ignore, to push down into the quiet spaces between heartbeats where I kept all the things I wasn't allowed to feel. The evening had been unremarkably ordinary. We'd ordered Thai food from the place down the street that always forgot to include the spring rolls, but somehow never forgot to charge for them. I'd spread my psychology textbooks across the coffee table while Lionel commandeered the couch, laptop balanced on his knees, muttering curses at his thermodynamics problem sets. The fan in the corner had hummed its steady rhythm, pushing around air that smelled like jasmine rice and the faint mustiness that lived in the walls of every cheap apartment near campus. We'd watched a movie afterward, something forgettable with explosions and dialogue that made us both cringe. Lionel had provided running commentary, as he always did, his observations growing more absurd as the plot became increasingly ridiculous. I'd laughed despite myself, despite the way his presence beside me on the couch made me hyper-aware of every casual touch, every moment when his knee bumped against mine or his elbow brushed my arm. This was our routine. This was safe. This was the life I'd built around the careful architecture of restraint and reasonable expectations. But now he was looking at me with that grin, and the toothbrush felt suddenly heavy in my hand. I realized I'd been standing there longer than necessary, caught in the act of staring. Heat crept up my neck, that telltale flush that betrayed me whenever Lionel's attention focused too intently in my direction. He shifted his weight, pushing off from the doorframe with lazy grace. His voice, when it came, was soft and teasing, carrying that playful edge that always made me feel like I was missing some essential piece of information, some joke that everyone else understood. Goodnight, quiche. The words hung in the air between us like a question mark made of smoke. I felt my lips curve into what I hoped was a casual smile, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when he'd laugh and shake his head and disappear into his room, leaving me to analyze the interaction until dawn crept through my bedroom curtains. But he didn't move. He stayed there, leaning against the wall now, hands tucked into the pockets of his pajama pants, watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't quite serious. Lionel was never fully serious about anything, but it wasn't entirely joking either. It occupied some dangerous middle ground that made my pulse quicken and my throat feel suddenly dry. I wanted to ask if he was kidding. I wanted to laugh it off, to retreat to my room and pretend this moment had never happened. I wanted to do anything except what I actually did, which was step closer, close enough to smell his shampoo and the lingering scent of the coffee he'd been drinking all evening. My kiss was quick, cautious, a brief brush of lips against his cheek, chaste and safe and utterly forgettable. Or it should have been forgettable. It should have been the kind of gesture that friends make without thinking, affectionate but meaningless, a punctuation mark at the end of an ordinary evening. I meant to pull back immediately, to step away and mumble something about getting some sleep, to return to the careful distance that had kept us both safe for all these months. But before I could retreat, before I could restore the equilibrium that had been our unspoken agreement, he tilted his head slightly, and his voice came out in a murmur that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to some deeper place inside my chest. Not there. Two words that changed everything. Two words that shifted the ground beneath my feet and made me realize that the narrow hallway had become something else entirely. Not just a passage between bedrooms, but a threshold between the life I'd been living and something vast and terrifying and utterly unknown. I stood frozen, toothbrush forgotten in my grip, watching as his grin softened into something more complicated. The silence stretched between us, filled with the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the muffled sound of traffic from the street below. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Someone's footsteps echoed in the stairwell. Life was continuing around us, ordinary and predictable, while we existed in this suspended moment that felt like the edge of a cliff. His next words came so quietly, I almost missed them, delivered with a gentleness that made my knees feel unsteady. One more. The question settled into my bones like a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. I understood, with the kind of clarity that comes in moments of absolute terror, that whatever I did next would change us. That the easy friendship we'd built, the comfortable routine of shared meals and late-night conversations and careful boundaries, was balanced on the edge of my response. I could laugh. I could make a joke about his need for attention, could ruffle his hair and tell him to get some sleep. I could restore the distance, pretend I hadn't heard the vulnerability threading through his voice, hadn't seen the way his eyes had gone soft and uncertain in the dim hallway light. Or I could step forward into the unknown. The toothbrush slipped from my fingers, landing on the carpet with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. Neither of us looked down. Neither of us moved to pick it up. We stayed locked in this moment of possibility and terror. Two young men who had been circling each other for months without either of us daring to acknowledge what was happening in the spaces between words, in the silences that lasted too long, in a way we'd learned to exist in each other's orbit like planets held in place by invisible gravity. I knew, even as I stood there paralyzed by the weight of choice, that this was the moment I would remember later as the beginning of everything. The moment when the careful life I'd constructed began to crack open, revealing all the longing I'd kept hidden beneath layers of reasonable expectations and quiet resignation. The hallway held its breath. Lionel held his breath. I held mine. And somewhere in that suspended silence, everything began to change. To understand what happened in that hallway, you have to understand how we'd arrived there. Two 22-year-olds who had somehow built a life together without either of us quite meaning to. The apartment had found us through a Craigslist ad posted at 2 in the morning by someone desperate enough to split rent with a stranger. 3 rooms, 1 bathroom, kitchen appliances that had seen better decades. The kind of place that exists in the margins of college towns, where young people learn to make homes out of hand-me-down furniture and shared responsibilities they're still figuring out how to handle. I'd answered the ad because I needed quiet. My junior year was going to be brutal. Double majoring in psychology and history meant libraries that stayed open past midnight and textbooks that cost more than groceries. I needed someone who wouldn't throw parties every weekend, wouldn't leave dishes moldering in the sink, wouldn't treat the living room like their personal entertainment center. What I got was Lionel. He'd moved in on a Tuesday, carrying boxes that seemed to contain equal parts engineering textbooks and what appeared to be every cable that had ever been manufactured. His side of the apartment became a testament to brilliant chaos. Circuit boards scattered across his desk like puzzle pieces, coffee mugs forming geological layers on every available surface, clothes that migrated from drawers to chairs to floors in a cycle I never quite understood. But he was quiet when it mattered, never brought people over without asking. Always replaced the milk when he finished it. Had a way of cleaning up his messes just before they became truly unbearable, like he possessed some internal timer that prevented disaster. More than that, he was easy to be around. I'd lived with roommates before, the kind who felt like strangers you happen to share a lease with, where every interaction carried the weight of careful politeness. With Lionel, conversation flowed like water finding its level. He could talk about thermodynamics with the same enthusiasm he brought to analyzing why our upstairs neighbor seemed to rearrange furniture at 3 in the morning. Everything was interesting to him. Everything was worth discussing. I was the opposite in almost every way that mattered. I kept my half of the apartment organized with the precision of someone who'd learned early that chaos was dangerous. My books were arranged by subject and then by author. My clothes hung in the closet by color and season. I wrote notes in margins with different colored pens: blue for important concepts, black for questions, red for connections to other readings. My friends from class knew me as reliable, thoughtful, someone who could be counted on for study groups and borrowed notes, but who rarely stayed for drinks afterward. I'd learned to carry myself with a kind of careful invisibility, present enough to be helpful, but forgettable enough to avoid scrutiny. But with Lionel, something different emerged. He had a way of asking questions that made me realize I had opinions I'd never spoken aloud. He'd interrupt his homework to debate whether cereal counted as a legitimate dinner option, or why people felt compelled to clap when planes landed, or what kind of person decided that lima beans needed to exist in the world. These conversations happened mostly late at night, when the apartment settled into its quiet rhythm, and we'd find ourselves in the kitchen or living room, supposedly getting water or retrieving forgotten textbooks, but somehow ending up talking until we heard birds beginning to sing outside. He told me about growing up with 3 sisters who treated him like a living experiment in brotherly tolerance. I told him about parents who meant well, but had somehow raised me to believe that taking up space was presumptuous. He complained about professors who assigned group projects to engineering students who preferred solving problems alone. I admitted that I sometimes chose the hardest classes available because struggle felt more familiar than success. We developed routines without discussing them. Coffee runs to the place near campus that served breakfast all day and didn't judge customers who showed up in pajama pants. Shared playlists that bled through the thin walls between our bedrooms. His music loud and energetic, mine quieter, more introspective, somehow finding harmony in the overlap. Arguments about whether it was worth cooking actual meals or if we were destined to survive on delivery food, and optimism until graduation. To anyone watching from outside, we must have looked like opposites who'd learned to coexist. Lionel, all noise and warmth and spontaneous energy. Me, careful and contained, always thinking 3 steps ahead. But inside the apartment, we moved around each other with an ease that felt inevitable, like we'd discovered some natural rhythm that neither of us had to work to maintain. For me, it was dangerous territory. I'd spent years learning to manage my expectations, to appreciate friendship without wanting more, to find contentment in connection that had clearly defined boundaries. But living with Lionel felt like trying to maintain careful distance while sharing the same small space, breathing the same air, falling asleep each night, knowing he was just a wall away. I noticed things I shouldn't have noticed. The way his hair looked when he'd been running his hands through it during difficult problem sets. How his laughter sounded different when it was just the 2 of us versus when other people were around. The particular quality of silence that settled between us during late-night conversations, comfortable and charged at the same time. For Lionel, our closeness seemed effortless in a way that made me both grateful and quietly heartbroken. He could fall asleep on the couch during movie nights, completely unguarded, trusting me to turn off the television and make sure he had a blanket. He could wander into the kitchen wearing nothing but pajama pants and bedhead, completely unself-conscious, making coffee for both of us without being asked. It was the kind of intimacy that people take for granted when it doesn't carry the weight of unspoken longing. The kind of friendship that felt like the most natural thing in the world to him and like a daily exercise in restraint for me. This was the foundation we'd built together over 18 months of shared space and easy conversation and careful boundaries. This was the life that had led us to that moment in the hallway, where everything I'd learned to keep hidden was suddenly pressing against the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. This was how 2 people who thought they understood the shape of their relationship could find themselves standing in dim light, asking questions that had no safe answers. I should have known that the hallway moment wouldn't disappear with morning light, wouldn't fade into the category of late-night confusion that we could both pretend to forget. But some part of me hoped it would. Some part of me spent that first night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, convinced that when we encountered each other over coffee and leftover Thai food, we'd both smile awkwardly and let it dissolve into the comfortable amnesia that protects friendships from moments that venture too close to dangerous territory. I was wrong. The next evening, I found myself lingering again after brushing my teeth, caught between wanting to rush to my room and some invisible force that kept my feet planted in the hallway. Lionel emerged from his bedroom, wearing different pajamas, but the same expression, that half-smile that lives somewhere between joke and invitation. He leaned against his doorframe exactly as he had the night before, hands tucked into his pockets, head tilted at an angle that made his hair fall across his forehead. The similarity was so precise it felt almost rehearsed, except for the way his eyes held mine a beat longer than casual conversation required. "What, no kiss tonight?" His voice carried the same teasing edge, but underneath it was something else, a thread of genuine question that made my chest tighten. I realized he'd been waiting, not just standing there by coincidence, but actually waiting to see what I would do. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself that friends could share this kind of easy affection without it meaning anything profound. I leaned in and kissed his cheek again, quick and light, the same chaste brush of lips that could have been exchanged between siblings or longtime friends or anyone who cared about each other in perfectly acceptable ways. But when I started to pull back, his hand came up to rest briefly on my arm. Just a moment of contact, fingers warm against my skin, before he let go and smiled and disappeared into his room. It became a ritual after that. Not every night, but often enough that I began to expect it, began to find myself moving more slowly through my bedtime routine, listening for the sound of his door opening. Sometimes he'd ask directly, voice light and playful. Sometimes he'd just stand there waiting, eyebrows raised in mock expectation, until I rolled my eyes and stepped closer. The kisses stayed innocent, brief contacts against his cheek or temple, over almost before they began. But they accumulated weight with repetition, each one settling deeper into the space between friendship and something unnamed. I began to notice the way his skin felt warm under my lips, the way he sometimes closed his eyes for just a moment before I pulled away, the way the silence afterward stretched a few seconds longer each time. What frightened me most was how natural it felt, how quickly something that should have been awkward became part of our evening rhythm, as routine as making coffee or arguing about whose turn it was to take out the garbage. Lionel treated it with the same casual ease he brought to everything else. Asking for goodnight kisses the way he might ask if I wanted to split a pizza or had seen his thermodynamics textbook. But I was keeping careful count. 7 kisses over 2 weeks. Each one cataloged and analyzed until I could replay them with perfect accuracy, examining every detail for signs that meant something or nothing at all. The dangerous moment came on a Thursday night in October. I've been struggling with a particularly complex research paper about trauma responses in adolescence, spending hours reading studies that made me question everything I thought I understood about human resilience. My eyes felt strained from staring at journal articles, and my shoulders ached from hunching over my laptop. Lionel found me in the kitchen around midnight, making tea and rubbing my temples. He asked about my paper, and I found myself explaining the research in ways that surprised me. Not the dry academic language I usually retreated into, but something more personal, more connected to why the work mattered. He listened with the kind of attention that made me remember why I'd chosen psychology in the first place. Asked questions that showed he was actually thinking about what I was saying, not just waiting for his turn to talk. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then told me he thought it was important work, that he admired how much I cared about understanding people who were struggling. Something shifted in that kitchen conversation. Some barrier that had been maintaining careful distance began to feel less solid. Later, when we found ourselves in the hallway, the ritual felt different. I leaned in for the usual quick kiss, aiming for his cheek, but he turned his head slightly at the last moment. Not enough that our lips met, but enough that I could feel his breath, could sense the warmth of his mouth just inches from mine. When I pulled back, his hand came up to rest at the back of my neck, fingers threading briefly through the hair at my nape before letting go. The touch lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it sent electricity down my spine in a way that made me understand how far we drifted from innocent territory. He murmured goodnight, like always, smiled like always, disappeared into his room like always. But I stood in that hallway for long minutes afterward, heart racing, try to convince myself that the moment hadn't meant what every nerve in my body was insisting it meant. I spent that night lying awake, finally admitting to myself what I'd been refusing to acknowledge. This wasn't harmless anymore. The careful boundaries I'd built around our friendship were dissolving, and I was falling toward something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no way to see the bottom. The worst part was that I wasn't sure if I was falling alone. The transformation happened gradually, like water wearing away stone, so subtle that I didn't recognize it until the landscape of our friendship had already changed beyond recognition. The kisses grew slower. That was the first thing I noticed, lying awake afterward, replaying each interaction with the obsessive attention of someone trying to decode a language they'd never learned to speak. What had begun as quick brushes of lips against cheek began to linger. Not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves as significant, but enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin, could catch the faint scent of his shampoo, could register the way his breathing shifted when I was close. More unsettling were the silences that followed. In those first weeks, Lionel would smile and immediately retreat to his room, treating the kisses like punctuation marks at the end of ordinary evenings. But as October deepened into November, he began to stay. Just for a moment, just long enough for something unnamed to settle in the air between us, before he'd clear his throat or run a hand through his hair and disappear behind his door. I found myself analyzing these pauses with the same intensity one brought to my psychology coursework. 2 seconds meant nothing. 5 seconds might be coincidence. But when the silence stretched toward 10, when I could see him searching my face, as if looking for answers to questions he couldn't articulate, I began to understand that whatever was happening wasn't contained to my own confused longing. Our conversations changed too. The easy chatter that had always characterized our friendship began to include deeper currents. Late-night talks that started with complaints about professors or speculation about our upstairs neighbor's mysterious furniture rearrangement schedule would somehow drift toward more vulnerable territory. He told me about feeling like he was always performing for other people, that his natural ease in social situations had become a kind of trap. Everyone expected him to be the entertaining one, the one who could lighten any mood or deflect any awkwardness. With our engineering classmates, with his family, even with the friends he'd had since childhood, he felt like he was playing a role that had been written for him before he was old enough to question whether it fit. But here, he said, gesturing around our small living room with its mismatched furniture and the fan that hummed too loudly and the stack of takeout menus held to the refrigerator with magnets from places neither of us had ever visited, here he could just exist. Here he didn't have to be amusing or charming or anything other than himself. I listened with my heart in my throat, recognizing the gift of his honesty while simultaneously aching with the knowledge that I was withholding my own truth. How could I tell him that his unguarded moments were exactly what made me lie awake at night, memorizing the way his voice softened when he talked about things that mattered to him? How could I explain that the comfort he found in our friendship was the same comfort that was slowly destroying my ability to maintain careful distance? Instead, I found myself sharing pieces of my own carefully guarded inner world. I told him about growing up feeling like I took up too much space, about learning early that being useful was safer than being noticed. I admitted that my academic success felt more like anxiety management than genuine achievement, that staying busy with difficult coursework was easier than confronting the quieter questions about who I was and what I actually wanted. He listened with an attention that felt like being held, asking questions that showed he was thinking about what I was saying long after the conversation ended. When I mentioned struggling with expectations, family, academic, social, he nodded with understanding that went beyond polite sympathy. These late-night confessions began to shift the balance of our friendship. The apartment became charged with a different kind of intimacy, the air thick with things we were beginning to say aloud and other things we still kept locked away. I would catch him looking at me sometimes during these conversations, his expression soft and searching, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. The most dangerous change was how he began seeking out my presence. Where before our time together had been largely circumstantial, shared meals, movie nights, conversations that happened because we were both in the same space, he started creating opportunities. He'd emerge from his room when he heard me moving around the apartment, would suggest coffee runs or grocery store trips or walks around campus that served no practical purpose beyond spending time together. I told myself these were natural developments in a deepening friendship. I told myself that people who lived together and enjoyed each other's company would naturally gravitate toward more intentional connection. I told myself that the way my pulse quickened when he appeared in the kitchen, sleepy-eyed and asking if I wanted to get breakfast somewhere, was just appreciation for his company. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and I could hear him moving around in his room, just beyond the thin wall, I couldn't escape the growing awareness that we were both reaching towards something we couldn't name. The careful architecture of our friendship was becoming something more fluid, more dangerous, more impossible to navigate with the old rules. The good night kisses continued, but they had become loaded with weight that threatened to collapse the fiction that this was all innocent affection between friends. Each time I leaned in, I felt like I was stepping closer to the edge of something that would change us irrevocably. Each time he lingered afterward, eyes searching my face in the dim hallway light, I sensed that he was struggling with the same terrifying recognition. We were falling toward each other with the slow inevitability of gravity, and neither of us knew how to stop. The revelation came on a Tuesday night in late November, when the apartment felt smaller than usual and the weight of unspoken things had grown so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. We'd spent the evening studying in the living room, our textbooks creating separate territories on the coffee table, while the space between us hummed with the familiar tension that had become our constant companion. Lionel was working through fluid dynamics problems, muttering occasional curses at his calculator, while I struggled with a particularly dense chapter about attachment theory that felt uncomfortably relevant to my current state of mind. The irony wasn't lost on me. Reading about how people form emotional bonds while sitting 3 feet away from someone who had become the unwitting center of my entire emotional universe. Every paragraph about proximity and familiarity breeding connection felt like academic confirmation of what I was living through, and I found myself closing the textbook more often than I opened it, distracted by the sound of Lionel's pencil scratching against paper and the way he absently ran his fingers through his hair when calculations weren't cooperating. Around midnight, when my eyes had started to blur from staring at pages that might as well have been written in a foreign language, I announced that I was giving up for the night. Lionel looked up from his work, hair disheveled, eyes slightly unfocused from hours of mathematical concentration, and smiled in that tired way that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his usual confident self. "Yeah, me too," he said, gathering his papers into a pile that would inevitably scatter across his desk by morning. "This stuff is melting my brain." We moved through our nighttime routine with the choreographed familiarity of people who had learned to navigate shared space without collision. I brushed my teeth while he organized his textbooks. He used the bathroom while I gathered the coffee mugs we'd abandoned throughout the apartment. Small domestic rituals that had become as natural as breathing, except tonight they felt weighted with anticipation. When I emerged from the bathroom, toothbrush in hand, he was already waiting in the hallway. Not leaning against his doorframe in his usual casual pose, but standing in the center of the narrow space, hands at his sides, watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something had shifted in the few minutes we'd been apart. The easy tiredness was gone, replaced by a tension that made the air feel electric. I approached slowly, uncertain what had changed, but unable to ignore the way my heart rate had accelerated in response to whatever I was seeing in his face. When I stopped in front of him, close enough for our usual ritual, but not quite touching, he didn't move to make it easier. Didn't tilt his head or lean forward or do any of the small adjustments that had become part of our unspoken choreography. Instead, he stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes that seemed to be asking questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. I leaned in anyway, aiming for his cheek as I had dozens of times before, intending to deliver the same quick, safe kiss that had become our routine. But as my lips brushed against his skin, his hand came up to rest at the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair with deliberate intention rather than the brief, accidental touches that had marked our previous encounters. And he didn't let me pull away. The kiss that should have lasted 2 seconds stretched into something longer, something that crossed the carefully maintained boundary between affection and intimacy. I could feel the warmth of his skin, could register the way his breathing had changed, could sense the subtle shift in his body as he stepped closer instead of maintaining distance. When I finally did start to retreat, confused and terrified and desperate to restore the safe space we'd been occupying, he kept his hand at my neck, holding me in place with gentle but unmistakable intention. Our faces were inches apart, close enough that I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his pupils had dilated, the almost imperceptible tremor in his breathing. Why does that feel real? His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were unexpected, but because they gave voice to the thing I'd been trying not to acknowledge for months. The thing that had been growing between us in the spaces between words, in the silences that lasted too long, in the way we'd learned to exist in each other's orbit with increasing gravity. I opened my mouth to respond, to say what I wasn't sure, to deny it, maybe, or to laugh it off, or to retreat into the safety of pretending I didn't understand what he meant. But before I could speak, before I could find words for something that felt too large and fragile for language, I saw the look in his eyes. Unguarded, trembling, terrified. This wasn't mockery or confusion or the kind of casual experimentation that people his age sometimes engaged in when boundaries got blurry. This was recognition. This was someone realizing that what they thought was a game had become something with stakes they hadn't anticipated. The truth hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we were brave enough to cross. Everything we'd built together, the easy friendship, the comfortable routines, the safe harbor of mutual understanding, balanced on the edge of this moment. We could step back, pretend this had never happened, restore the careful distance that had protected us both. Or we could acknowledge what was happening and risk everything we'd created in the hope of finding something neither of us had known we were looking for. I stayed frozen in that space between his hands, heart hammering against my ribs, understanding that whatever I said next would determine whether we spent the rest of our time as roommates pretending this moment had never existed, or whether we stepped together in a territory that promised either everything or the destruction of everything we'd built. The hallway held its breath. Time suspended itself around us. And in that silence, I realized that the choice was no longer whether to fall, but whether to fall together. The days that followed were unbearable. I withdrew into myself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned early that retreat was safer than risk. The morning after our hallway encounter, I emerged from my bedroom to find coffee already made and a note saying Lionel had gone to campus early for study group. Relief and disappointment warred in my chest as I stood alone in our kitchen, holding a mug that still held the warmth of his attention even in his absence. I began timing my movements around his schedule, leaving for classes before he woke, staying late at the library, finding reasons to be anywhere but in the apartment where the hallway seemed to pulse with the memory of what had almost been acknowledged. When we did encounter each other, I kept conversations brief and practical. Did he need anything from the grocery store? Had he seen my psychology textbook? Surface-level exchanges that served as careful barriers against the deeper current that threatened to pull us both under. But avoidance only worked for so long in a space as small as ours. Lionel grew frustrated with my evasion tactics in ways that manifested as restless energy he couldn't seem to contain. He'd appear in doorways when I was trying to read, hovering with questions that seemed designed more to force interaction than to gather information. He started conversations that felt like gentle interrogations, asking if I was okay, if something was wrong, if he'd done something to upset me. Each question was delivered with the same careful casualness he brought to everything else, but underneath I could hear something raw, confusion, maybe, or hurt that I was suddenly treating him like a stranger after months of growing closeness. The worst part was seeing the gradual dimming of his natural brightness, the way my withdrawal was teaching him to second-guess interactions that had previously felt effortless. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell him that my distance wasn't rejection but self-preservation, that I was terrified of wanting too much from someone who might have been caught up in a moment of curiosity that daylight had already dissolved into regret. But every time I opened my mouth to speak honestly, fear closed my throat around words I couldn't risk saying aloud. The breaking point came on a Thursday night, nearly 2 weeks after our hallway encounter. I'd spent the evening hiding in my room, pretending to work on a paper that remained stubbornly unwritten while I listened to the sounds of Lionel moving restlessly through the apartment. Around midnight, when I thought he'd finally gone to bed, I ventured out to get water and found him sitting at our kitchen table, still fully dressed, staring at his hands. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment we just stood there in the dim light from the stove, the silence heavy with everything we hadn't said to each other in 2 weeks. Then, without preamble, he spoke in a voice that was quieter and more serious than I'd ever heard from him. "We need to talk." The words landed in my stomach like stones. I wanted to flee back to my room, to maintain the careful distance that had been protecting us both from having to examine what was happening between us. But something in his expression, exhausted, determined, almost heartbroken, kept my feet planted on the kitchen tile. I sat down across from him at the table where we'd shared hundreds of meals and late-night conversations. But the familiar space felt different now, charged with the weight of everything we'd been avoiding. He was quiet for a long moment, gathering words, or courage, or both, before he finally looked directly at me. "I can't figure out what I did wrong," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice made my chest ache. "2 weeks ago we were fine, and now you can barely look at me. If I crossed a line or made you uncomfortable, I need you to tell me so I can fix it." The assumption that he had done something wrong, that my withdrawal was punishment rather than protection, hit me like a physical blow. I could see the genuine distress in his eyes, the way my careful distance had been interpreted as rejection rather than the desperate self-preservation it actually was. "It wasn't you," I said, the words scraping out of my throat like they were lined with glass. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Then what?" His voice carried a frustration that seemed directed more at the situation than at me, but made me flinch anyway. "Because we were good, Ezra. We were really good, and now I feel like I'm walking on eggshells trying not to upset you in ways I don't understand." The pain in his voice was unbearable. Worse than my own confusion or fear was the knowledge that my cowardice was hurting him, that my inability to be honest was poisoning the one relationship that had ever felt completely safe and natural. The truth balanced on the edge of my tongue, terrifying and necessary. I could keep lying, keep pretending that nothing had changed, keep protecting us both from the risk of honesty. Or I could trust him with the thing I'd been carrying alone for months, the weight that had been growing heavier with each shared moment and careful touch and late-night conversation. "It wasn't a joke to me," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "It never was." The words hung in the air between us, confession and apology and explanation all at once. I couldn't look at him as I spoke, couldn't bear to see whatever expression would cross his face as he processed what I was admitting. Instead, I stared at my hands folded on the table, waiting for him to respond with a gentle rejection that would at least put an end to the terrible uncertainty. But when he finally spoke, his voice was soft and wondering rather than shocked or uncomfortable. "Then why did you think I kept asking?" I looked up despite myself, meeting his eyes across the small table, and saw something there that made my heart stop and restart in a different rhythm. Not confusion or pity or the awkward kindness of someone trying to let a friend down easy. Something else entirely. Something that looked like relief. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside our windows. In that silence, I began to understand that maybe I hadn't been falling alone after all. Maybe the careful distance I'd been maintaining had been protecting us from nothing more dangerous than the possibility of happiness. The conversation that followed wasn't what either of us had expected. There were no grand declarations or dramatic revelations, no moment where everything suddenly clicked into perfect clarity. Instead, we sat across from each other at our small kitchen table, speaking in careful, halting sentences about things we'd never put into words before. Lionel told me he'd been confused for months, that the easy friendship we'd built had gradually become something he couldn't categorize or understand. He'd never questioned his attraction to women, had dated throughout high school and his first years of college without ever considering that he might be capable of feeling something similar for a man. But living with me had introduced complications he hadn't known how to process. It started as curiosity, he said, fingers tracing patterns on the table surface between us, about why I felt so comfortable with you when I felt like I was performing for everyone else. Why I looked forward to coming home more than I looked forward to going out. Why I started making excuses to spend time together instead of just letting it happen naturally. He'd initiated the goodnight kisses, he admitted, because he'd wanted to test something he couldn't name. To see if the warmth he felt when we were close was friendship or something more complicated. Each night, the boundary had become less clear until he'd found himself looking forward to those moments in the hallway more than anything else in his day. I listened with my heart in my throat, understanding that what I'd interpreted as casual experimentation had actually been his own careful exploration of feelings he'd never experienced before. The realization that we'd both been navigating uncharted territory, both confused and frightened, and trying to understand what was happening between us, shifted something fundamental in how I saw our entire relationship. When it was my turn to speak, the words came easier than I'd expected. I told him about recognizing my attraction to men in high school, but never acting on it, about learning to keep that part of myself carefully contained in the interest of avoiding complications. I explained how living with him had made that containment impossible, how his easy warmth and unconscious intimacy had gradually worn away every defense I'd built. The goodnight kisses had been torture and salvation simultaneously, moments when I could express something true while still maintaining the fiction that it meant nothing. Each time he'd lingered afterward, each small touch or extended silence, had fed a hope I'd tried desperately to suppress. We talked until the kitchen windows began to lighten with dawn, mapping the careful territory we'd been navigating separately for months. There were long pauses, moments when one of us would start to speak and then stop, searching for words that could capture feelings too complex for easy explanation. But gradually, the shape of what we'd been building together became clear. Neither of us used the word love. Neither of us made promises about what this meant for our future or how we would navigate the practical complications of a relationship that neither of us had seen coming. Instead, we focused on the present moment, on the relief of finally speaking honestly about the connection that had been growing between us in the spaces between words. When exhaustion finally overtook us, we found ourselves in Lionel's bedroom without discussing how we'd arrived there. The transition felt natural, inevitable, the logical conclusion to a conversation that had stripped away every careful barrier we'd maintained. We lay down fully clothed on top of his covers, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not quite touching. The silence between us was different now, not weighted with unspoken tension, but soft with the possibility of rest. For the first time in months, I felt no need to monitor my responses or maintain careful distance. Lionel's hand found mine in the space between us, fingers intertwining with a gentleness that made my chest ache in the best possible way. His touch carried no urgency or demand, just the simple comfort of connection finally acknowledged. The apartment around us was quiet, suspended in that peaceful hour when the world feels held in parentheses. Somewhere in the building, a door closed softly. Outside our windows, the city was beginning its daily rhythm of awakening. But inside Lionel's room, time felt irrelevant. He shifted closer, close enough that I could feel his breath against my temple, could smell the familiar scent of his shampoo and the coffee we'd abandoned hours earlier. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, soft with exhaustion and something that might have been wonder. "Good night," he said, the word carrying the weight of all the nights we'd spent circling each other in that hallway. All the careful kisses and loaded silences and moments of almost recognition. I turned my head slightly, pressing my lips to his temple in a kiss that felt different from all the others. Not tentative or careful or weighed down with questions about what it meant. Just honest. Just true. This time, he didn't ask for another. He simply turned closer, his arm coming around me with the natural ease of someone who'd finally stopped fighting gravity. We fell asleep like that. Two young men who had spent months learning to orbit each other finally allowing themselves to rest in the closeness they'd been afraid to acknowledge. The story didn't end with certainty or promises or clear answers about what came next. It ended with the weight of honesty, with the relief of no longer carrying unspoken feelings alone, with the simple comfort of falling asleep beside someone who knew the truth and chose to stay anyway.